There's been some interesting news out there about whether AI technology should be subject to self-regulation, meaning industry regulation, or standard regulation, which would be imposed by the government, whether that's the federal, state, or local government. And in my view right now, given the fact that AI is so embryonic, until it's used at a mass market level, it really makes sense to start with self-regulation, creating appropriate trade industries, making sure that there's some norms in place, what AI can and cannot do, what AI should or should not be used for, before we get to actual legislation. Now, having said that, there are some interesting bills before Congress, and the NTSB has one that's been in both houses of Congress for some time now, as to regulating, automotive vehicles. The FAA has enacted certain regulations as it relates to regulating drones. But what we've seen, in my view, thus far, is that the regulations haven't caught up to the practicalities of application in using the automated vehicles on the road or drones, for example. We've identified soft spots in the regulations out there. So I think self-regulation is the better approach because the manufacturers, the programmers, the companies out there that are involved, they have every incentive to ensure that the AI is going to be used correctly and parameters are built and rules of engagement are adhered to as it relates to how to use the AI in a way that's productive and safe to our society. It also gives the legislatures time to catch up with how to regulate all of these new technologies. And part of the challenge with AI is there are new technologies being developed every day. And so there's no way for our laws to stay on pace with that type of growth. So I would start with the foundation of a self-regulated industry group, and then after that layer, actual regulations. I think AI has a tremendous importance at the federal and foreign policy levels of our government. And I think funding, it needs to be prioritized. For example, national defense, you may have heard or read about robotic use for the Army. Obviously, we've had drones in place, aerial drones, that is, in multiple theaters throughout the world. So continuing to fund those programs is important. Ultimately, it keeps Americans safe. It keeps our troops out of harm's way. And it also, in my view, helps with foreign policy because it can act as a deterrence to any aggressive behavior from a rogue state or a rogue group. Also, it ensures, in my view, that we're prioritizing funding for the right types of AI, and we're making an effort to be number one in the world and to set the benchmark there. So I think prioritizing funding in Congress is something that should be emphasized much more than it is today. There have been notable shortcomings with AI in the news. Obviously, vehicles, there have been several incidences with vehicles out there involving AI malfunctions or improper use. What the statistics have said, however, is that human beings are really the weak link in the accident causal chain. And computers are generally safer and more reliable in terms of decision making and execution than human beings are. And that's because they are not subject to a lot of the limitations that we have. They're not subject to emotional decision making. They're not subject to impairment, whether that's through inebriation or some other physical impairment. So in my view, despite the issues that you've seen on the news with, for example, automotive technologies out there and drones, it's part of the growing pain of any new technology. I'm sure we all remember the internet. 10 years ago, it's very different. It was very different than it is today. It's also regulated differently than it was back then. So, continuing to have faith allow the companies and the programmers to do their job, I think that will allow us to reap the benefits of AI technology. It'll also permit the laws to catch up, because from a legal point of view, we're not quite there yet. There's a lot of questions that are still being pondered and need to be addressed.